What's up, APUSH Nation, and welcome to the inaugural video for the 24-25 year. Great to be back and looking forward to helping all of you, especially my Brophy APUSH class, get through the year. I'm going to start today with an awesome topic that we've talked about in class, and that is chaos in the colonies in the 17th and 18th centuries. This is going to be really a topic that hits upon a theme we've been establishing in class, which is that what happens in Europe does not stay in Europe. The events of Europe directly transpire, directly transcend over towards the British North American colonies. And I'm going to look at a few examples of case studies today where that's obvious. And in each of these case studies, the central idea to always keep in mind is that what happens in Europe does not stay in Europe. And so there's this transatlantic consequence, this cause and effect type reaction to certain events. And you could also look at these as changes over time as well as continuity. So great opportunity to improve those AP skills as well as looking at good content knowledge for future writing prompts. So let's dive into today's chaos in the colonies topic. The first example I want to come at thematically fits the idea of Native American wars. And although these wars didn't translate into fighting in Europe, certainly the competition in Europe that was going on for supremacy in the New World is going to prompt a series of conflicts that involve Native American groups as well as European groups. And the first of those is the Beaver Wars. Now, this was a conflict that lasted for over a century almost throughout the 16 and 1700s. And the Beaver Wars are a great example of a common term in conflict known as proxy wars. This is when one group, one power source versus another power source isn't directly fighting each other, but instead they're using substitute armies, or in other words, proxy armies, to do the fighting on their behalf. And one consequence of the European arrival, beyond the initial contact and beyond the initial wars with native groups and the decimation of native populations due to diseases, one of those consequences is that native sides began to have to choose between which European power they aligned with. And as a result of those alliances with European powers, they were almost always motivated through one purpose, and that was to increase trade value. Native American groups already had a monopoly before Europeans arrived on the fur trade. And the fur trade would quickly become one of the most lucrative trade commodities in the New World for the Europeans once they began setting up their colonies and trade shop. And as a result of this demand for furs, native groups began to ally and eventually were dragged into a series of wars that raged for over a century and caused irrevocable harm for native populations. The two native groups that were most directly related to the Beaver Wars and most often served as these proxies with native European groups, between native and European groups, were the Iroquois, who fought often against the Algonquin and Huron tribes. Now, these were massive networks of natives that existed all throughout New England, the middle colonies, getting into even as far as modern-day Ohio, which was not a colony, one of the original 13. But these Beaver Wars took place all throughout New York, Pennsylvania, parts of New England, and they were murderously bloody wars that cost thousands and thousands of native lives and truly set in motion some of the events that we're going to talk about with the French and Indian War, which is, again, natives being dragged into European conflicts as a result of European issues, and especially, in this case, competition over the fur trade. The other native war that we're going to bring up is known by two names, Metacom's War or King Phillips War. And this relates to a devastating war that took place in New England in the late 1600s, between 1675 and 1676. Now, this war was significant because it is really the second generation of English and the second generation of native who for years had lived somewhat peacefully and coexisting in a sort of stable state in New England following the arrival of the first Pilgrims and then later Puritans that populated New England by the thousands upon thousands throughout the 1630s, 40s, and 50s. By the time we got to the 1670s, though, it's the sons and even the grandchildren of those first English settlers who survived, and it's the sons and grandchildren of the natives who had first assisted the English in their settlement of Massachusetts area and other New England colonies. But it's the second sort of generation conflict that's going to emerge and lead to one of the deadliest conflicts in the history of North America. Metacom was the name of the son of the former chief of the Wampanoag tribe, Massasoit. And Massasoit was the chief who worked with and peacefully coexisted with the English when they settled in Plymouth and surrounding areas. But it's Massasoit's son, Metacom, who the English had named Philip, who ultimately faced one of the great dilemmas that any leader in Native American history had to face, which is the further encroachment of English coming for various reasons, whether it was proprietary or, as we know, mostly religious reasons. Metacom faced an unbelievable crisis in loss of land, and he did what very few native leaders did at the time, which is that Metacom attempted to rally even enemy tribes together in order to fight off the English. He saw the writing on the wall, and he saw that ultimately the only survival tactic for the Native Americans potentially was to fight back. And in trying to unify some of his enemy and allied tribes, Metacom did something that very few native leaders had done. Now we know that in the Spanish Empire, there was a successful uprising led by Pueblo natives in New Mexico, but that only lasted for about 10 years before that uprising was eventually crushed. So what Metacom was trying to do in New England had never been done before, and ultimately he put an incredible uprising effort together to try to throw back the growth of the English in New England. This war led to a staggering loss of life on both sides. It is estimated that approximately 10% of New England settlers were killed. 10%. We're talking thousands. And this didn't just include soldiers. Native American tribes on Metacom's side attacked villages up and down New England's coast, and in the interior, entire settlements were wiped out. But the consequences for Metacom and his people and the allies, native allies, was even more staggering. Tens of thousands were either killed or many more were sold off into slavery, some of which went down to British islands in the Caribbean, as well as different parts of the English New World. So this will result in a just death blow to Metacom's effort. He was eventually killed in this conflict as well. Just devastating loss for the natives. And it really highlights this reminder that these European conflicts just decimated native populations. And in the end, there are so few examples in which Native Americans won victory, even in battle, very few examples. And so Metacom's war will be a crushing defeat for Native Americans. Speaking of Native American conflicts, another one that is somewhat related to Native American conflicts, we're going to pop down to Virginia into what is really one of America's first insurrections ever. And that is going to involve Native Americans, indentures, enslaved Africans, and white planters in what is known as Bacon's Rebellion. Nathaniel Bacon was a wealthy planter living on the frontier, the extremes of the Virginia colony, and his peoples were under constant pressure, constant conflict with native groups. So Bacon appealed to the bigger government of Jamestown and the Virginia colony for support and for help, in which he was rebuked. Now, the governor at the time was a man named William Berkeley, and so this is going to eventually become a showdown between Berkeley and Bacon. So Berkeley kind of turns his back a little bit, says, no, we're not going to get involved, stop warring with natives, and Bacon decides to insist upon continuing the fight. Eventually, tensions run so high between Bacon, his followers, and the Virginia government that Bacon is going to lead a march onto the capital in Jamestown, where over a course of many months, he'll continue to war with native tribes, but he will build a following to eventually garner what is the first uprising in the American colonies against a colonial government. Keep in mind, all 13 colonies have their own colonial governments, and so Bacon decides to take out his wrath upon the Virginia government in Jamestown. Eventually, Bacon makes his way all the way to Jamestown. His settlers will burn Jamestown almost to the ground completely, and this becomes an all-out conflict between a whole sort of group of peoples. I mentioned, indentures were involved. Bacon rallied many indentures, and there even were some enslaved Africans that joined his crusade as well. Ultimately, Bacon would be defeated, not necessarily in battle, but by disease. He died of dysentery. Ouch. So Bacon did not ever see the fruits of his labor come to pass. But one key thing that Bacon did do was that he and his followers created a list of grievances against the Virginia government, and this sets in motion foreshadow for 100 years after Bacon's rebellion, which took place in 1676, just around the same time, by the way, as the Native American Wars up in New England with Metacom and King Philip. So almost 100 years around the time Bacon's rebellion took place, Thomas Jefferson, another Virginian, is going to write the Declaration of Independence, which is basically one massive letter reminding the king of all the things that had gone wrong. And Bacon did this as well in his attempt to inform the English government of all the things that were going wrong in Virginia. Bacon will die somewhat of a martyr, and his legacy is shrouded in a bit of controversy because it was a violent insurrection. With this quote here, Bacon will no longer be regarded as a rebel but as a patriot, because insurrections proceed oftener from the misconduct of those in power than from the people. So this sets in motion this idea of rebellion in the colonies. And speaking of rebellion in the colonies, we're going to get to one shortly here, which was a rebellion over in England. But one other thing to mention about Bacon's rebellion, this is a critically important issue because it ultimately increases the suspicions of indentured servitude. Should this system persist, if we can get planters and indentures teaming up together, that was a dangerous prospect for many of the English leadership. And so what you start to see is a trend starting in Virginia, but this will spill over into many of the colonies. Increased fear of indentures leads to increased numbers of enslaved Africans. There is a direct correlation that following Bacon's rebellion, you start to see throughout the numbers in the colonies more and more importation of enslaved peoples rather than indentures. So the tables are going to turn, and that represents a major change over time. The continuity is, of course, that labor systems continue to grow in the New World, but the change over time is the increased usage of enslaved peoples. So that is a really key factor with Bacon's rebellion. And speaking of rebellions, something we have to continue to talk about with this theme of what happens in Europe does not stay in Europe. In 1688, there was an overthrow of the English monarchy. James II was forced out by Parliament. He's told basically, if you don't leave, we will kill you, which they had done previously in the mid-1600s in the English Civil War, where Charles I was beheaded by parliamentary forces. So the King of England, by the late 1600s, James II knew that Parliament wasn't fooling around. So Parliament threatens James II, and they say that we're going to bring in your daughter, Mary, and her husband, William, who were descendants of James II, but they were ruling at the time in the Netherlands. So this is a wild sequence of events for English history. You're going to get a Dutch king coming to rule England in the form of the monarchy known as William and Mary. And this is what is called the Glorious Revolution because there was no bloodshed. It was a peaceful, somewhat peaceful transfer of power. Why we need to care about this in APUSH, because this is more European history, is that the transfer of power in England is going to directly impact what's going on in the Americas. And I'm going to give you 3 quick examples to think about. First of all, there's going to be a revolt in Boston to overthrow the Dominion of New England. This was snuck into a reading we did in the last couple of weeks. But under James II, he had had a very strict very controlling, very authoritarian sort of colony created that lumped all of the New England colonies into one sort of government, which was tremendously rejected by many colonists. But the Boston Revolt will take place after news reaches the colonies about William and Mary, and so they're going to overthrow the local New England government, and that is a good example of a direct effect of the Glorious Revolution. Number two, there's going to be a Protestant revolution in Maryland. We talked about Maryland as a Catholic refuge, but that's going to change after the Glorious Revolution, and so Protestantism is going to take root and cement itself into Maryland. And then lastly, Leisler's rebellion. Jacob Leisler was a German living in the colony of New York, and he led an uprising, a little mini coup d'etat, in an attempt to overthrow the New York government, which was again a consequence of the Glorious Revolution. Leisler and his conspirators were ultimately executed. They were caught, and William, this is one of his first tasks as the new King of England, was to order Leisler and others' death for betraying the colonial government. So clearly, what happens in Europe does not stay in Europe when it comes to Leisler's rebellion, the Protestant Revolution in Maryland, the Boston Revolt, even Bacon to some degree, because again, the colonial governments and their rulers were directly tied to England. So we have to see that the colonies are growing more and more chaotic as they reach towards the 1700s. One more chaos in the colonies to mention is the infamous Salem witch trials. And the Salem witch trials get a lot of attention, especially as we barrel our way towards the fall here. But what's critical to realize about the Salem witch trials is that although tragically 19 people were wrongfully executed and sent to their deaths under beliefs of witchcraft, in general, witchcraft and witch trials were nothing new in Europe or the American colonies. In fact, Salem wasn't even the very first example of witchcraft trials. There were ones in Connecticut and other parts of New England, much in part due to the sort of paranoia and hysteria created by the Puritans. We saw that with the Anne Hutchinson trial, in that way she was banished before she eventually and her family left the Mass Bay colony. But Salem will always forever be this sort of quintessential example of the continuous Puritan influence, but it represents a change over time, because shortly after this trial, keep in mind, it is not long after the Glorious Revolution as well, shortly after this trial, the reign of the Puritans is going to really start to diminish. And what people throughout the colonies realized was this dangerous affiliation between church and state, marrying the church and the religion with the rule of the government, had to stop. And so you start to see a tremendous shift in the colonies of moving away from church and government being so tethered and so married. And though, unfortunately, it took 19 people's deaths to send that message, the Salem witch trials will always be a reminder of that important shift in colonial history away from church and state. So that about wraps it up for tonight's APUSH Fireside Chat, our first of the year in 24. Thanks for listening, everybody. For my guys in class, we'll get back to action tomorrow, and we'll be focusing more on examples of what happens in Europe does not stay in Europe. For now, I'm going to sign off as I always do. Remember, everyone, the past shapes the future. Take care, and have a great day out in APUSH Nation.